All right, good morning to everyone on the line. Thank you so much for joining us. We'd like to give a very warm welcome to our CEO sponsor community, as well as all of our guests on the line today. We're very happy to bring you this webinar, Analytics for Driving High Performance, with Alec Levenson, a Senior Research Scientist with the Center for Effective Organizations, and Alexis Fink, General Manager of Talent Intelligence Analytics at Intel. Before I hand it over to them, I just have a few housekeeping notes. Everyone who is on the line this morning, your lines are muted just for sound quality. So if you do have a question that you'd like to ask during the session, you're welcome to raise your hand. I will see that and I can unmute you. Otherwise, a good option is to share your question in the text box, as we'll be able to see that through the session. Please do send your question to everyone. If you send it just to me, I'll happily share that back so that Alexis and Alec can see that. We are recording this webinar. The recording and the deck will be sent out to all participants in the next few days once this is done. And we'll send the link that you can share along or watch again if you'd like. Just a little bit about our presenters today. Some of Alec's focuses are the economics of human resources and org design, HR and human capital metrics, analytics and return on investment, and strategy. And some of Alexis's focuses are talent analytics and data science applied to talent, large-scale organizational transformation, and integrated talent management systems and competency systems. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Alec and Alexis.
Great. Thank you very much, Martina. And thank you, Alexis, for being along for the ride and for everyone who's on the line. We'll tell you up front that we are doing this partly as a preview for a longer session we're going to be having in San Francisco, hosted at the Gap. A program that goes over last 2 days long. We'll give you information at the end, but if it feels a little bit like you might be sipping from a fire hose with the concepts that we go through the next hour, anybody who wants to dig into it a little bit deeper, we're very happy to have you join us in San Francisco. So when we talk about using analytics to be able to give us some insights into high performance, the first thing that comes to mind that I find all the time when I'm working with companies is that there is a fundamental difference between focusing on improving things as they are right now, so thinking about continuous improvement of our existing processes, how we do the work, how we go to market, how we interact with our customers. That is a core part of what we have to do to succeed in the business, and it is a primary focus of analytics. I would say that probably 95 or even 98% of the analytics that we see out there tends to focus on how is it that we can make incremental improvements in what we're doing today. And it's very important. If we don't do that, we can't find the extra pennies to be able to reinvest in the business, to be able to hold our margins up, to be able to make the promises to our stakeholders and to our shareholders. And that is a fundamental part of why we do analytics, and there's absolutely no reason to be bashful about it, and it's important to do. But what we find over and over again, and we see this, I see this in the clients that I work with, Alexis has found this in the companies where she has worked, is that that's one very important part of what you have to do when it comes to looking at the organization. But just as important is the question of, are you actually meeting the strategic objectives of the organization? Okay? Are you actually able to execute the strategy the way it's intended? And we all know that there are always gaps in that. In fact, sometimes the gaps are enormous. And the problem with how we do analytics 98% of the time is that even though we might be adding value, even though we might be showing how we can save some extra pennies, make things more efficient, get our employees more engaged, get our leaders to be more communicative, all of the things are important, but they often miss the much bigger picture of how is it that you're actually going to help solve those gaps in the strategy. And so that's the challenge that we have, and to do that, you really have to think differently, and you have to think about breaking the frame of how you do your analytics right now and looking at them in an entirely different way. let's see here, I'm trying to advance. Oh, there we go. And I'll turn it over to you, Alexis.
Great, thanks Alec, and thanks to all of you on the line. Alec did a great job of laying out some of the high-level framework. My job is really to talk about the nuts and bolts inside of this and try and compress that into 15 to 20 minutes. One of the key things to pay attention to in terms of getting value out of analytics and getting that strategic value is the fact that there are many layers to this pyramid on the slide. Essentially, solid data is really going to be the foundation of everything that we do. You can't get away from a garbage in, garbage out kind of problem. So having a foundation of accurate, complicated, or complex relevant data is really important. And as you think about strategic analytics, it becomes important to look at the data you actually have. Many data systems are only capturing transactional data, which are not terribly relevant for strategic purposes, and in many cases are not actually even in a format where they are analyzable using good mathematical techniques. So before you can do anything interesting or strategic with your analytics, you have to make sure that you have a solid, trustable, high-quality access to data. Beyond that, to Alec's point, the first thing, and in many cases 80 to 90% of the data work that you'll do, is really going to be in reporting. This is absolutely basic blocking and tackling. Who do you have? Where are they? How is that changing? That's essential information for any organization to capture, and it is part of the road to really getting to that deeper strategic opportunity. Moving up the line, you get to metrics, which is more of your scorecards, and that's where you start to add value judgments to those reporting elements. You start to add ratios and return on investment. You start to add metrics of efficiency. Are these things doing as they were intended? You're doing linkage analysis across. You may be looking at multiple components. We've got some slides on this a bit later, but really moving now from simply a fact-based assessment of what is to a value or strategically based assessment of what should be, where do we want to be, and what does good look like. Most organizations for decades have only gotten that far, and reporting and metrics have really been enough. In fact, many of you in the organizations in which you function have probably really experienced your analytics as only going that far. Who do I have, and what's the return on this learning investment I may have made? What's the number of successors I have per cell on my succession plan, and is that an adequate or appropriate number? It's not good to have 1, it's not good to have 10. What's the appropriate number, and what am I spending to get each one of them there? Metrics are valuable. Metrics, however, are not the whole story. The thing that's become very fashionable in the last few years have been predictive and prescriptive analytics. And this is where you start to apply often more sophisticated mathematical techniques, but more importantly, you're really starting to derive unique insights from the work that you're doing. And the benefit of those insights is that gives you something on which you can really inform a strategic decision. You're learning something you didn't know before. You're not working within, in a metrics framework, the bounds of a statistical process control chart. You're genuinely finding some new information, some new opportunity, and providing yourselves the foundation for the business value. The challenge is where I see talent analytics get almost across the finish line and not quite there is when they don't drive all the way to that decision, to the decision recommendation, and to actually taking action in the system, actually intervening, and having created an intervention, looping back through the entire process. You'll hear a lot of these things repeated in 2 slides, looping back through that entire process to make sure that the intended outcomes of that opportunity for insight are actually coming to pass, and being vigilant against unintended consequences. So really getting to that goal state, the sexy state that you read about in the HBR articles, et cetera, of getting to analytics and decisions, it's built deeply on a foundation of solid data, solid reporting, the ability to know who, where, what they're doing, solid metrics, the ability to know whether they're good or bad, and then advancing and making a bit of a step change into that analytics space and ultimately into the opportunity to make decisions that will drive your business. Alec, can you advance? Look at that. Yep. much like the old truism of all you have is a hammer, you'll see every problem is a nail. One of the things that I've found in 20 years of doing this work is problematic is whoever is charged with doing the work tends to see all problems through the lens of their own worldview. And one of the things we've seen in the industry over the last 5 to 10 years as deeply effective is the opportunity to look across those boundaries and look at different core types of expertise. Where many people looking at particularly talent problems will start with an HR person. Absolutely, you need that deep core expertise on what makes good management. How do you engage employees? What does an effective staffing process look like? How do you structure jobs so that they can be done efficiently, effectively? How do you move people through a talent pipeline? How do you ensure you have an adequate bench for your leaders? All of that is deep and specific content domain expertise that is absolutely necessary. It's not, however, sufficient for doing this work well. And you'll note my pyramid on the prior slide starts out with data expertise. It's been fascinating to see the explosion of data that are available and also the explosion in time it takes to analyze those. If you talk to data people, they'll talk about 90% of your time being spent in data management and data cleaning tasks before you start to do the very first interesting analysis. That's something you can change materially through deep expertise in data extraction, data transformation into something that you can analyze, the management of those data, et cetera. That's a really foundationally different or fundamentally different area of expertise than really knowing what makes a fantastic leader and what are the core experiences someone gets to be that person. I've been doing this work for about 20 years. I haven't yet found anybody who is deeply expert in those content areas and who also writes really amazing SQL code. They tend to be different people. Moving on up the pipe, once you've got data that you can analyze, the analytics are also a really core skill set. And while you'll find people who have expertise across maybe the yellow and the blue box or maybe the green and the yellow box together, it's quite rare to find someone who has all three. And again, you'll need, as you start to do this work, access to, if not resident on your team, someone who can really do fantastic analysis. I'm amazed at the number of times I find someone who knows one methodology. They know decision trees really well. They know a Pareto chart really well, and they'll view all problems as something that they could apply their favorite tool to. And while that tool may have a place, the odds of the one thing you know how to do being the right solution for the analytical problem at hand are relatively low. In addition, there's been tremendous expansion in the area of data visualization in the last few years, and that gives you a whole new way to interact with data and drive insights in a way that's efficient, that's human, that people can consume easily, and that starts to border on some of the graphic design principles that your mathematicians often struggle with a little bit more. So how do you now start to make sure you've got all of those types of analytics? The heavy math, the advanced statistical modeling, the understanding of the parameters of your data so you know what types of analysis are even possible, as well as the way to present that back to folks so that they can interpret it, make sense of it, gain those insights, or even drive those metrics and analytics in an elegant and efficient way. And finally, from an analytics standpoint, making sure that you can do the basic fundamentals of validation. Is the analysis that you ran correct? Is that visualization that you created an accurate reflection of the underlying data? And about 6 months ago, I added the pink box. I was running out of good colors, but I watched more and more projects struggle and fall because the content was great, the data were solid, the analytics were clear, and the stakeholder management was absent. Executives and decision makers are people too. They don't like things that come up to them and say, hey, you're stupid, you've been making bad choices all this time. So some of that influencing around building the right partnerships so that you're not creating threat with the analyses that you're doing, so that you're bringing people along in deciding the questions from the beginning so that they are invested in the answer as opposed to creating sources of conflict. The opportunity to actually have someone deliver deliver data and then immediately get an insight from it, that's influencing expertise, as well as being able to take that last step in my pyramid, figuring out what an action is. You'll see that again on the next slide. That's influencing expertise as well. What are the universe of actions that are possible? What are the universe of actions that would be relevant? And what are the universe of actions that we should target at this time? Alec, were you starting a question?
So I actually wanted to jump in before we get off this slide, and yeah. I can imagine if we had everybody sitting in the room now listening, I could see some people's faces going a little bit blanching as they were listening, thinking, "Oh my goodness, I can't do all of this myself." And so I'm here to. So this is the economist rescuing you from the psychologist to tell you that that in fact you can't be all of these people.
That's absolutely correct.
Yeah, and one of the things that, in fact, we see entire kind of safety HR departments making mistakes on often is thinking that you have to build the really deep analytics expertise. I mean, like there's a couple of things, there are a couple of misconceptions that people have. One is that you have to have total rock stars in doing analytics before you can think about making deep insights, and that's absolutely not correct. Yeah, and because you can, first of all, you can find them, but secondly, a lot of what you need to do often doesn't even require having advanced statistical skills. You need to be able to, and we're not going to have time to get into in depth here. This is a kind of these are kind of topics we get into a lot more in depth, in the program we're going to be running. But when you think about things like how is our business in China doing? How is our call center in Peoria doing? Okay. Those kinds of questions are about the performance of an entire group. And without getting into a whole dissertation on statistical analysis, when you're talking about performance at that level of the whole group, you actually don't have enough data to be able to go run fancy statistical analysis. You basically have one outcome, which is how's that group doing? And a lot of the insights that we need come out of this content domain, the content expertise that Alexis was talking about. So what do we know about the business? What do we know about how people actually interact with each other? Where is it that things are aligned well or not in the organization? And that kind of analysis is just as important as running stats, and oftentimes it's more important. But that's what also is often missing a lot when we talk about analytics, because people equate analytics with hard data and running statistics, when in fact analytics is much broader than just that.
In fact, that's the reason I've become so excited over the last really 3 to 5 years about visualization, is it really gives easy access to, how is the store in Peoria doing in a way that is much more discoverable than a giant Excel chart that you have to sort. Your ability to put up, for example, a graph of the geographies that your company covers with color coding or size coding on a set of whatever they are, histograms or even pie charts, and be able to really quickly look at, oh, I'm going to now, because I have good data expertise on the extraction, the transformation, I've managed it well, because I have good content expertise on the variables that matter, because I have good ability to analyze them in a way that's meaningful, not necessarily in a way that is sophisticated, and put that together in a visualization, I can use what is the change in month-over-month same-store sales across the nation, and I want to see the places that have had, I want to highlight the biggest swings up and the biggest swings down. Quick tap filter, pull this forward, and you can start to see where you have significant trends in a way that doesn't require scrolling through a 400-row spreadsheet, and that becomes a really, really important tool.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other point, which is directly related to that, is that no data is perfect. Right. So when it comes to doing, oh, I don't know why you laugh, Alexis. When it comes to doing, so there's this fundamental problem that we have, and I have to say that our business partners are oftentimes the cause of this, because they will say things like, "Well, get me an exact headcount number." Now, I don't know about you, but you know, in any organization above a size of like 10 or maybe 100 people, even saying what is our head count, that can change from minute to minute. You know, it can change from hour to hour. And it's a real, the business actually puts us in an unfair position anytime they say, well, we need a single moment of truth, you know, a single point that says, this is what, you know, this is who we are and this is how many we have. And I see a lot of people who get tied up in knots when, you know, when they're trying to be strategic and their business partner says, oh, I don't believe your data, you have to go back and prove it to me. Hey, that is an invitation to get, you know, go down a rabbit hole you may never recover from. You have to know the data well enough, and you have to have the confidence to look at them and say, I know you like that certainty, but in fact, we don't measure everything with complete precision, and there's going to be, you know, you might not like the, you know, the way that we calculate turnover. You might not like the way we calculate headcount, because how do we deal with our part-timers? How do we deal with contingent workers? Okay. All those things are important, and you do have to make progress on those measurement questions, but you can't stop them from asking the deeper, more important questions about what are the actual decisions we have to make with this data. And you know, it's going to be imperfect, but the dirty little secret, I love one of the business partner I worked with at one point, a guy who had spent his time as like a nuclear engineer, was coming over to work in HR. He'd love getting those kinds of questions because he could turn them back on the business people and say to them, I know your machines. I know how imprecise they are. You know, you like to pretend that everything is measured, you know, perfectly, but there's a lot of error there too. So, you know, the more you know the business, the more you can point out to them that they make big decisions and big bets on the basis of imperfect data. That puts you in a much better position to do what you have to do to clean the data, do what you have to do to make it easily accessible, you know, but don't go overboard, and make sure you carve out enough time and space to focus on the big question.
Well, and that's part of where the influencing expertise becomes really important as well. Those of you who've spent much time reading any Peter Block over the last, gosh, when did this book come out, the 70s, will recognize that sometimes a question is really just resistance and discomfort. And sometimes a question is legitimately, hey, wait, you're trying to talk about total headcount, but in Israel, 30% of our headcount is classified as students, but they're really 50% time over 5 years as part of a co-op program. They're a core part of our labor force. Therefore, you can't exclude students in Israel because it's so much a part of our strategy. So sometimes it's, you're telling me something that's uncomfortable, and I have to throw up any possible roadblock to avoid dealing with it. And sometimes it's, hey person, you are missing a core piece of data that might actually change the way we're thinking about this. We really do need a revision. So the content expertise, the domain expertise in the business, as well as some of that influencing expertise, to be able to talk somebody down when it's really resistance, and to be able to get to the points you can agree on with the data you have in front of you today, becomes really important. There's a very delicate balancing act between standing up for your data and pushing through today, and acknowledging where there may be subsequent analysis to be done, putting a pin in those things that need to be held to another day when there might genuinely be something that makes a difference. And that's a difficult thing to do. And it's one of those things that, one of those places where I see people get frustrated and, in fact, choose to leave this kind of work because they have a hard time dancing that particular line.
And I'm just going to pause for a second here. We have some questions that came through.
Great.
So first question was, what value do you place on HR data maturity models for driving this work? Do you want to take that one, Alexis?
Sure. The HR data maturity model that I'm most familiar with is the one that Burson puts forward, and they'll talk about moving all the way up to the predictive and prescriptive analytics, prescriptive being the highest. Those are the ones that tell you what to do. Predictive just says what will happen. Prescriptive says what to do about it. I actually do place some credence on those. The challenge is people start to fetishize those predictive and prescriptive analytics, where, to Alec's opening point, there's an enormous amount of value just from doing the basic blocking and tackling, just from knowing how many people you have and where they are, just from knowing whether you're getting the return you should be getting on your manager training program, just really managing your business professionally also requires a good deal of data. So some of the models have almost disparaging names. The first phase, the reporting phase, in some of the models is referred to as counting, and the second phase is referred to as clever counting, which makes it seem like it's smoke and mirrors, or you know, sort of a second grader who thinks that they're all that in a bag of chips. And the truth is there is enormous business value even in that sort of counting and clever counting stage. It is also really important to know, to have access to, through the analytics expertise and the data expertise, those more advanced techniques in terms of the prescriptive, knowing what's going to happen, and predictive, knowing what to do about it kinds of methods for those problems where using one of those techniques could really add significant business value. I see an enormous number of, the first question almost everybody asks when they fire up a talent analytics function is, wow, help me predict attrition. That one kind of breaks my heart, because I feel like there are many more interesting problems where you could be applying your predictive and prescriptive analytics than just trying to stop outflows in your organization. Outflows in your organization can actually be incredibly healthy. You can apply it to the kinds of things that I think Alec will talk about later in terms of how are you structuring work? How are you making sure that processes are getting you the outcomes that you need? How are you doing things that affect not one individual, but affect the entire unit of analysis, the entire store or department or division or process flow? So those analytics maturity models can be very helpful in clarifying and providing language. The challenge is to make sure that you don't lose those core elements. I used a pyramid for a reason, right? It really is foundational, and you can't not do those things. Make sure that in pursuing the prescriptive and predictive analytics, you don't lose sight of those basics of high-quality data, basic reporting, and fundamental metrics that let you run your business day-to-day. In a book chapter that I wrote, it was an Oxford Handbook of Talent Management on metrics recently, we really talk about the fact that there's a bit of a flywheel between those things at the bottom, the reporting and the metrics, and those things at the top, where the reporting and metrics go on, they're part of your ongoing process, and they might flag an area that's in pain that would trigger an analytics, predictive, prescriptive analysis and decision type of project that would be an episodic thing. That commission or that project might be disbanded. You'd then monitor it with your reporting and metrics until something else emerged that was a potential problem area, spin up another episodic or short-term task force or project to do something on the analytics, prescriptive, predictive, let me do analysis and decisions. So both of them happen. They happen in a little bit of a different way. So the reporting and analytics will go on, the reporting and metrics rather, will be ongoing and part of measuring your health. That's like getting on the scale every morning, whereas those higher level, the predictive, the prescriptive, the analysis, and the decisions, those are more really targeted at a particular opportunity, a particular pain point, and they tend to kind of come and go as opposed to being ongoing every day.
Perfect. I bet that was a much more detailed response than John ever expected to get. So I do have to say just one editorial comment. Anytime those maturity models show a difference between descriptive versus predictive, they're actually selling a little bit of a false bill of goods, because any good social scientist will tell you that a really good descriptive model is one that basically tells you what happens. Mm-hmm. And the only difference between what happened versus predicting is you then say, well, given what happened in the past, here's what we think will happen in the future. But there isn't a new model, there isn't a different kind of model to run that gives you predictions that are different than the description. So anyone who tries to sell you a canned solution that claims that it's, very different because now it's predictive is, well, they're probably trying to sell you the Brooklyn Bridge. There were a couple of other questions. Marion, I would like to invite you to resubmit. You said role of coaching ? If you can tell us a little more what you mean, happy to address it. And then I think this is just more comments. Steve says that think of the analogy to revenue in the finance function like headcount. HR does not need to apologize for our metrics like headcount, but we do need to understand and describe our business rules for counting, to which I say absolutely.
Yes, exactly.
All right, so now moving on.
Yeah, I promised you that I would be repetitive, and I am. This is taking that pyramid, and instead of talking about the different lines of data at a tall level, now walking through one particular project. So think about one of those analysis projects that I mentioned on the last slide. Reporting goes on all the time. Analysis would be more project-based. This walks you through how you go about doing that effectively, and I've recently added this sort of section off to the right where it highlights why you need all those different types of expertise and why you can't just have a single phone a friend that you ask one time and they go away. I'll also, when I walk through this slide, which I'll try to do relatively quickly since we're already at our halfway mark and Alec has quite a few slides to cover as well, I'll also walk through some of the things that I tend to find as pitfalls through my own work, leading teams that have done this, and then spending a good deal of time coaching folks in other organizations who do these things. It amazes me the extent to which people try to do only that row or that bar which is in red in the middle. They really want to effectively and appropriately analyze data, and they kind of think that their job begins and ends there. And I have yet to see a project really be successful where the project began and ended with, hey, here's a file, analyze it, thanks a lot. In truth, to do it really, really well, you need to walk through an entire process. And those of you who have taken research methods, you'll notice that this looks a lot like the scientific method. Shocking, I know. But one of the things that I find incredibly rare, frankly, is stopping and making sure that you ask the right questions. It becomes incredibly difficult to do anything useful if you simply answer the question that you're given. How many people do we have here? Well, how many people we have here, you might be able to provide an answer to that, but you'll often end up in an endless bring me a rock exercise where someone asks you the follow-up question and the follow-up question and the follow-up question because they're not really getting their business needs solved. And frankly, the people asking the question, it's not their job to know all the data that are available and all the ways in which it could be analyzed to solve that business question. As the analytics team, that's your job to know. And one of the things that has made a tremendous difference in my team over the last 4 years since I've been making them do this is anytime a question comes in, we don't, frankly, answer it. We're a little frustrating to work with. Well, the first question back is, well, what's the problem you're trying to solve? What's the business question you're trying to answer? What's the decision that you're trying to make? Tell me why you're asking for this data, and then I'll help you figure out if the question you asked is going to get you there or not. This has dramatically reduced the number of bring me a rock exercises and really shortened the length of our engagements. People are often annoyed by the follow-up question, but at least the first time. And then what I've found is over time, working with the same clients over and over, they stop giving me a command that says, pull this data for me, and start coming with, hey, I'm trying to figure out. And then together, we can really identify what the right way to frame that question is. I've also, I joke all the time that every day I wear to work an invisible T-shirt that says, I'm not in the curiosity business. I have a limited number of analysts. I've got about 5 people who really do a lot of analytical work supporting a company of 100,000. I don't have time for every whimsical thing that crosses your mind. If you're not solving a business problem, if you're not struggling with the decision and you need to know whether to go right or left, I frankly don't have time for you. So let's really think about what are the key questions that matter to the business, and then let's really effectively make sure that we're answering that question with an appropriate technique and with a justifiable answer. So once you've got that first question identified, you have to figure out what's the right method to answer that question. One of my favorite stories here is a few years ago, a head of HR came to me and said, hey, we need to take an action in our selection process, and wanted to just do it by fiat. He'd read an article in the Wall Street Journal that suggested this would be a good idea, and he was suggesting a fairly significant process change. And so we walked a little bit through what was he trying to solve for, why did he want to make this process change, and said, give me 30 days to do an experiment. And for this particular question, rather than just doing, I'm going to count something, or I'm going to run a regression to look at what might be the causal factor here, this particular question really was an experimental one. So we crafted a 9-cell experiment. I'm actually very proud of it. It made me super happy. And went through all of the cells and the conditions to find out whether the action he wanted to take was likely to deliver the outcomes he was trying to reach. We identified the right method that was actually going to answer the question, as opposed to simply taking the action. Having identified the right method, in many cases, that's when the hard part starts, and that's either locating the data, which may be in many different systems. It may be, in most organizations, hiding on spreadsheets and people's hard drives. It may not even be in spreadsheets. It might be on PowerPoints. Or if it's in a database, it might be a database that's purely transactional, and so it's not in any kind of shape to be effectively analyzed yet. In many cases, the questions you'll ask for don't even have transactional or other ambient, just sort of laying around data that you can analyze. You'll have to go out and generate new data. In the very vague experimental example I just used on the row above, we actually had to go and generate data. In this case, it was about selection, so we had to take some resumes from a year ago that we knew how they had turned out, and then we had to do some manipulation to them to test the conditions he was interested in. And then we had to have some real hiring managers plus the group we used as validators among the hiring managers to say, you know, keep us on track as a staffing organization, is this a good person or not? We had to have them go through and do ratings on a variety of criteria, et cetera. We had to actually generate new data. It's part of why it took us 30 days. So it will be either a matter of locating or generating the data. Rather than, in many cases, you're asked to simply use the data that are laying around. Some cases that's really perfect. In many cases it won't be. Effectively analyzing and effectively and appropriately analyzing that data, that kind of goes without saying. And if you're watching along, you'll see where we're pulling in the content and the influence on asking the right question. The content, the analysis, and the influence in trying to figure out what's the method. What are the data we have? How could we analyze them? What would be impactful for those leaders? You can follow along there on the right bar. Once the data are analyzed, most analytics teams or analytics projects believe that their work is done. And my challenge to all of you is to think of your work really as, in many cases, just getting started. Because the other invisible t-shirt I wear every day is just say no to data vomit. I heard someone say it very elegantly that people are trying to present an ocean of data when what they really need is just one symbol of insight. And taking those data that you've now analyzed, there's a product I owned years ago where the first spit out that came out had over 10,000 individual cells in it. I'm not handing any CEO 10,000 individual cells of data. It's not going to be useful. The real answer is going through, or the real magic is going through and developing the insight based on those analysis. What's changed, what's interesting, where is there opportunity, where could a decision make something different. So really taking the time to develop insight, again, that's where you're starting to get back to some of those influence questions, what matters to the business, some of those content questions, what are we really reflecting in these data. Having developed the insight, you don't get to walk away either. You are now the most expert person on the planet in these data, and you are abdicating your responsibility if you don't extend, as Alex said, extend from the descriptive to the prescriptive, extend from the insight to the action, decision, or change that you could make as a result. I argue frequently that you're really abdicating your responsibility if you don't drive all the way towards what's the action that we could take, what's the recommendation, what could we do to make a difference in our organization. Take action based on that insight. And then finally, vanishingly small numbers of people actually go back to that monitoring, measuring, and reporting row that I talked about on the last slide, measure the results to see if that action was effective, and monitor to make sure that it remains effective. Most things have a half-life, and after 6 months or 3 years or some period of time, the intervention you took has now been fully successful and everyone is, for example, passing your assessment, or the context has changed sufficiently that you have new and fresh opportunities. So make sure that you are measuring and monitoring those results to make sure that they're effective and that they continue to be effective over time so that you'll know when to trigger another research cycle. And with that, Alec, I think you have another few slides to go over in our next 20 minutes.
I do, except there's still one more that you get to talk about.
Oh, there is? Oh, yeah. Right. Yes, I love this slide.
Oh, there we go. Yep, go for it.
It's not coming up on mine. I don't know if it's coming up for other folks. But essentially, the voice.
Wait, hold on. Yeah. Martina, I think I lost internet connection. Oh, okay. You got
there we go. This really is almost as much of a scold to me and my fellow math-loving people as anything else. I've seen so many really beautiful, analytically sophisticated, gorgeous, gorgeous projects get put in a binder, put on a shelf, and had nothing happen. They can be just mind-blowingly cool, but if they're not making a difference to the organization, then they are really just a party game. And so part of the reason we start every conversation with, what's the decision that we're trying to make? What's the method that will help us make this decision? And rather than doing some incredibly cool deep learning analysis that would just make all of my analysts want to break out the champagne, sometimes we do a basic, I mentioned a basic experimental design where we weren't doing anything other tun chi-squares, which is one of the first things you learn in a statistics class. And beyond that, a lot of times we're not even doing chi-squares, we're just putting pictures on a map because we're doing a data visualization. And that great method or that really fantastic finding is going to make you feel 10 feet tall, but if it's not delivering value to your business, then it's actually just a hobby, and that's not what we're paid to do. So that sexy finding might blow your mind, but one of the responsibilities of an analytics organization is to make sure that we're driving value.
Yep, and to that I would add, I mean, a sexy finding is not defined by the level of statistics that you use. It's defined by, so there's sexy methods, right? So sexy methods are, we've got these, fancy statistical tools we're going to use. That seems really cool. But that's putting the cart before the horse. Yep. And the more important question is, what does the business really need to know? So, for example, I was just out working before this call, going and talking to some employees who are working in a store, and the fundamental question that company is facing is, do you have the right alignment between what people are spending their time doing and what the company needs them to do? I mean, that's the fundamental question. And, we want to know what motivates them. We want to know why they're actually choosing to show up for work or why they're calling in sick when they really aren't sick. And there's not a lot of statistics you can run to tell you that. You've actually got to go in, talk to them. You may go out there, you may run a survey, right? You may want to find out how they're feeling, and you could run some fancy, multivariate models. But at the end of the day, if you're not coupling that with going out there, really seeing what's happening, you're kind of flying blind because the data themselves aren't enough to tell you the whole picture.
Well, and this is also a good time for my brief ethics commercial, and that's often a Debbie Downer conversation, so I'll keep it light. But there are also, hey, you know what, they all have company cell phones. I can turn on the location tracking and see where they are on the day that they called in sick, and if they're anywhere near a golf course, I'm going to bust them. That's unethical and illegal in many cases. So sometimes that sexy method or that great finding is something that is just inappropriate and out of bounds. And so one of the challenges that I think we're going to see in an accelerating fashion over the next 5 to 10 years is how do we make sure that we don't get seduced by what is possible when what is possible is actually, for a variety of reasons, inappropriate. It'll lead you to poor conclusions, or it is unethical, illegal, or violates a psychological contract between you and an employee to the point where it would be damaging even if it was within the bounds of the law.
Yes, exactly. So this slide here summarizes a lot of what Alexis just was talking about, but I want to put it in the kind of terms that really point out the difference between where we are today versus where we need to go with analytics. So on the left, we have here a lot of what we do today. So a lot of turnover reports. I mean, why do we do turnover reports? Because we always have, right? Because we want to know, why, who's leaving, why are they leaving? Well, I think that one of the most dangerous things HR can do is produce a turnover report. Now, I'm not saying ignore turnover. We need to know if turnover is out of bounds, but producing a number that says this is the percentage of people who are leaving, that's just a piece of data. It actually isn't information. Information is how does it actually impact the business? Does it matter? So Alexis said earlier, sometimes turnover can be kind of healthy. I mean, certainly if you have people are not very motivated, who are not giving you their all, then turnover there can be good. And then we have this great innovation that a lot of HR analytics groups are doing where you now create this metric called regrettable turnover. The regrettable turnover is, are our top performers leaving? Because that of course is something we really want to get down if possible. Well, I'm not so sure about that. One of the problems with that line of thinking is that if you really want to get your high-performing turnover as low as possible, one way to do that is to make sure you hire in people who are going to be really happy to stay in that job. Okay? Now, if you do that, you still have higher performers, but you do that enough, and eventually the top end of that distribution, like the actual amount of performance you're getting out of those people, is going to go down because you're going to find that you're going to be selecting for people who are really happy to stay in that job, and you're going to be missing out on the ones who might want to come in and contribute, really hit the ball out of the ballpark, but then go on and do something else. And every time I have this conversation with a business leader and say, would you rather have really low turnover, or would you rather have moderate turnover, and the people that you're able to, the people that come in, they stay for long enough to contribute, but then they go off and do something bigger and better, either in the company or somewhere else. There's no pushback on that. It's always door number two. So even a turnover report or regrettable turnover in a vacuum, I don't know what to do with that information. And the same applies to every other thing we got here. Safety is really important. I love it when we have the safety committees that take over the entire organization. This happens a lot in heavy manufacturing, in mining, where people can die if you don't do the right things in safety. So of course you care about safety, but when you take it so far that you're then clamping down on people who are working in your office buildings, that are like, they don't even touch the heavy machinery, and you get this culture where you're going to bark at people because they're not holding the handrail. You can't drive safety incidents down to zero without incurring lots of other costs that are somewhere else in the organization. It's kind of like pushing on a balloon, right? If we push on the balloon and the part of the balloon we're pushing on is only about safety, then something else is going to get out of line. And in fact, those things could be really important for the business. Now, of course, some people will come back and say, what, you don't care about our people? You actually think, there should be accidents? The answer is of course not. But there's always an economic value to improving on any one metric. And it doesn't matter if it's safety, it doesn't matter if you're talking about, team member competencies, leadership competencies. We need to understand how does it contribute to the business and what's the actual return for making an improvement on that. And that's the point in this slide. Okay. Everything we do in the business has a trade-off. One of the biggest challenges that our business leaders have is that there are multiple objectives that they are trying to accomplish at any one time. They need to keep costs down. They need to keep quality up. They need to have time to market be as fast as possible. You need to keep your market share, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we have the same kind of challenge when it comes to HR data. Any single piece of HR data you want to look at, whether it's turnover, competencies, time to fill, name anyone you want. There's always going to be a diminishing economic return to making an improvement in that metric. And the only way that I can know where we want to be focusing our attention is to look at the bigger picture of how does it all fit together. What are we trying to accomplish in the business? What is it that we need to know to answer those questions? So I'm taking the exact same process Alexis was talking about a couple minutes ago, and I'm just reframing it. Okay? We start with the business question. What are we trying to accomplish? Where do we need to go to get the information to answer those questions, and how does the data at hand help us? And the answer is we can't look at anything in a vacuum by itself. So what this leads to, and this will be the last slide before we give you the advertisement for our program. So this is a good time if anybody has any questions, think about getting ready to raise your hand or put them into the chat box. One of the really strong things that we advocate when we're doing this work, and this is a model that comes out of the book, put in my book, Strategic Analytics, which also we use a lot for the workshop. If you think about where HR analytics is today, we are actually in the bottom of this diagram of what I call human capital analytics here. We start with people. We start with the measurements around people. We start with the data we have at hand. We play around with it. We take a look at it. We learn something interesting, and then we try to go find a business problem that will help address. Okay? That's actually doing things entirely in the opposite order of how you should do it. Okay? You actually need to start with what are the actual business challenges that we have. And this gets back to the strategy execution question that we started with. So how are we actually accomplishing our business objectives? Where are we falling short on our business objectives? And what are the kinds of things keeping our line leaders up at night? And that's like question number one. And to start there, you actually have to be able to articulate how do we make money. Now, if I'm in a business like Intel, where they make money through their fabs and through selling these really awesome advanced products, to businesses to put them into the electronics that then make our lives, wonderful. It's very clear how they make money. It's through that part of the business. When it comes to things like keeping their offices clean, those are important processes, but they're not like really critical for the business. Okay. A different company, which is a business services company, where their job is to go in and clean offices, their competitive advantage comes from being able to be really top-notch in terms of cleaning. Okay. So both you have people who do cleaning of offices at Intel, and people who do cleaning of offices for the business services company, the janitorial services company, but it's only a competitive advantage for one of them. And so you want to be and so the janitorial company wants to be over-investing in those cleaning services for offices, whereas for Intel and any other company that's got their offices, for them it's more a kind of everyday expense, and you don't worry about going to the nth degree, unless of course we're talking about the clean rooms where everything is being manufactured for Intel, right? That's where you need to have not just top-notch, but like world-class people who focus on cleanliness. We don't even call them janitors there. What do you call the equivalent of janitors in a clean room?
I'm not sure, but it's a fancy name because like surgical scrub rooms are not this clean. It's really, I've been through them and it's impressive.
Exactly.
It's mind-blowing.
Exactly. So the point is that you need to, for any business that you're in, you need to know what is your competitive advantage, what creates it, and those are the business processes you want to put literally at the center of this. Now, the question you might be asking might not be right at the heart of your competitive advantage, and that's okay. But if it's not, if you're like, let's say you're 1 or 2 steps removed, then that's not bad. But if you're 10 steps removed, that's going to tell you that the question that you may be presented with, the business leader who came to you and said, you know what, I really want to understand this. If it's 10 steps removed from where the competitive advantage is, then I'm going to put that more in the category of the curiosity questions that Alexis was talking about before, and say, particularly because, I know for most people who are listening in on this, if you're in analytics roles or just in data roles, you get lots of requests. Tons of reporting requests. Give me this, give me that, give me the other thing, and it's really hard to be able to say no to people. But one of the best and most effective ways to say no is to say, I've got these 17 requests sitting in front of me, and here's all these ones where I know are really critical because if we don't answer them, the lights might actually literally shut off, right? Like we might not be able to service our customers. The question you're asking about is kind of important, but not really. Now, that may sound kind of harsh to, turn to somebody who might be an SVP and say, you're really not asking an important question. But the beauty of the influencing skills here is you don't turn to them and say, you're an idiot for asking this. You say, wow, I've got these other really strategic questions I have to answer first. Do you really think I should prioritize those first? And if so, do you want to go tell, the person who owns that part of the business that you're asking this other kind of simple question ahead of them? You put it back on them like that, and you'd be amazed at how quickly they'll say, well, no, that's okay. You can answer their question first, and we'll get to this later. And hopefully by the time it comes around again, they'll have totally forgot. So there's a lot more to this. I'll just say I don't want to go over our time, but when you think about the analytics involved, so you start with a competitive advantage, kind of understanding what drives the business at the top. The second phase is to look at the whole organizational system or the work group or the business unit, or the geography, whatever that part of the business is you're looking at, and say, what is it about the organization design about the way the team is brought together or is being managed that is enabling things to work well or not, that's actually the first level of analysis that you want to be conducting that's going to be data-based, but oftentimes that's not doing statistical analysis, doing what I talked about earlier, which is looking at how things fit well together, looking at where there's alignment, is goal setting being done appropriately, are you staffing the teams appropriately, all those really important questions. If this sounds like I'm talking about doing kind of regular OD work, you would be correct, and that's because really good analytics is not just about data, it's actually about being able to take the best of OD and analytics and bring them together, and is only if we, and then if you don't answer the question at that point, and a lot of times you do. You know, a lot of times we figure out, oh, there is a problem with how this team is chartered, or how they're being managed, or how we're resourcing them, or or how where there's issues about people collaborating across different silos in the organization. If those are the actual problems that are if those are the actual sources of the problems that that team is facing, then you have your answer right there, and you've done a good analysis, and you don't even have to go in and run any stats. Now, that isn't always the case, though, and so then if it turns out there are differences among people, like you've got different capabilities on the team, you got different people who are operating from very different mindsets, that's the point at which you can then dive down and go to the level of what we call a typical HR analytics, again, what I call human capital analytics here, but a lot of times you don't even have to get to that point. So where a lot of people are today in terms of HR analytics and starting there, we find is you don't even have to go there often to answer some of the most important questions that are out there in the business. So with that, I will stop, and if there's any other questions that people have, and feel free to raise your hand. In the meantime, we'll just put up a little advertisement for our program. So it's 3 days in May, the 10th to the 12th, but it's only 2 days of content. So we start in the afternoon of the 10th, and we end at lunch on the afternoon of the 12th. So you're welcome to, you can always fly in the morning and on the first day and then fly out on the last day to make it easy. And for those of you who have either attended one of my programs in the past or kind of looked at this, we have a similar title as the past, but we're doing it, this is a real, we're doing a pretty significant revamp because Alexis and I are co-teaching, and as you can hear from this, she brings a great perspective in to complement the approaches that I take.
Well, thank you.
So do we have any questions out there?
Anyone with a question is welcome to raise their hand or type it into the box. Or maybe you were so clear that there are no questions.
Well, it was all because of Alexis, I know.
Or people really have 10 o'clock meetings that they want to get to. That's also a possibility.
Exactly. Well, again, we'll leave it open for a minute longer, but we do. Oh wait, here's a question from Bryce. Thoughts on mitigating the potential for organizational culture preconceptions and beliefs to erroneously skew the interpretation and application of the data in the analytics phase. Oh, Bryce, you have no idea. Yes, amen to that. So that's actually one of the biggest problems. So our colleague at the center, Teresa Wellborn, has an entire program that she teaches, which is called, it's at different names over time, data coaching, database storytelling. How you take the data, how you take the analysis, and figure out how to get it to be heard is so important. There's a really great book by the authors are Heath and Heath. I forget their first names, but it's like a father and son. It's called Made to Stick or Make It Stick.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And it's an entire book that actually emphasizes that if you take a bunch of data and just throw them at people, and you can't make the data come to life, if you can't tell the right story, the right anecdote, give the right visualization, it's going to go literally in one ear and out the other. And so your point, Bryce, is so critical, which is, and in fact, one of the things that we preach, there was a program that John Boudreau, Sue Morman, and I ran for a number of years, which we call strategic HR metrics analytics. And the part that Sue talked about was always about using data to initiate change. And when you think about change, you actually want to start with the end in mind. You need to start with what is the change we want to enable in the organization, and you want to engage with the stakeholders from day one before you do any analysis. And that's because you need to build the case and make sure they're on board, first of all, that's for doing analysis, but then the other thing that I strongly advocate is that as you're going through it, you need to check back in with those key stakeholders at regular intervals. Because you could be analyzing the data and you start to find some interesting things and you say, oh, well, if we found this, then we're going to go to the next phase, the next phase, the next phase. If you wait until you've developed this highly complex story to then go back to the stakeholders and say, oh, wow, here's this amazing thing. Like, you asked me this one question, but I'm not bringing you this enormous, huge picture. So you might look at that and go, I didn't ask for that.
Exactly.
So there's a whole, like, we could spend hours talking about it, but yes, it's a great point, and that's actually one of the things that we are going to spend, some time working on in San Francisco for anybody who wants to join us. So with that, Martina, thank you, and thank you, Alexis.
Thank you. This is fun.
Thanks to both of you. Thanks for everyone for joining. We will be sending the slides to all participants afterwards, and I hope everyone has a great day. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.